Dear panelists, dear colleagues from the Gerda Henkel Foundation, from the Körber Foundation, let me welcome you to this hopefully very interesting panel. I have 3 good news at the beginning. To start with, news number 1. It will become quite a humorous panel, as I find out. There are 3 professors on the panel, but it's not like the professors I used to know at university. They started out there to play some jokes, so that's the first good news. The second good news is, obviously they don't agree on many of the issues we will discuss here, so it will be an interesting panel. And the third good news is they are all men, so they're short and brief in their answers. Having said this, let me acknowledge the existence of this history forum. If it hadn't been founded yet, it should be created now. And I tell you why. From my experience, I'm working in the world of conflict management, of international peace operations, and oftentimes when we send peace operations to a certain conflict, when we get involved in a conflict, either to prevent it or to transform it, as we say in our language, there is a huge lack of historical knowledge. We use some samples, and then we first go to Iraq, and then we go to Mali, and then we go to Afghanistan and Somalia and other places. And oftentimes in the assessment, in the conflict analysis, we're really lacking this historical knowledge. What is the real historical ingredients of a certain conflict? So therefore, I'd wish we had more panels like this and connect them to the practitioners in the field so they would learn more about it. And when we look at the conflict actors, as we call them, we always look at 4 different categories. First of all, what do they say? This is their position. Secondly, what is their interest? What do they really want? Usually it's access to power, it's access to resources. And then we look at their needs, economic needs, psychological needs, political needs, and we look at their fears. And many, many times we don't understand what their fears are because we don't understand the history of a certain society. So therefore, I really believe it's an important forum, and I'm really looking forward to learn a lot from our panelists here today. What the idea of the procedure is basically what the procedure, I think, always is. I have prepared a couple of questions for our panelists. And we'll have 2-3 rounds of questions here in order to kind of have a picture about what Neo-Osmanism means, where it comes from, what it means for current politics. And then, for sure, we try to open up to you, since I know so much expertise here in the room. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions later on. Let me start with you, Professor Ortaylı. You are a historian, and you have focused on the Ottoman Empire. And if this was a class of history students, and you had to describe them in 3 to 5 minutes, what are the basic traits of Ottoman Empire, their territory, their cultural identity, and what that means for nowadays Turkey?
Thank you. First of all, my diploma BA has the title of political science.
Oh, I do apologize.
But this is not in sense of your political science, you métier. This is French Sciences Po, administrative sciences and apparatus, Imperial School, like the gentleman nearby, Mr. Kırmızı. And you might degree, sir, but I'm not that. For me, I mean, I'm not quite an Popperian, Karl Popper man. I wouldn't say that's at all, I mean, a pseudoscience that I don't use. I'm not so nasty. I'm an historian, and historians have to use, first of all, textology, written documents, and or well-proofed oral documents, oral proofs. Certainly, I would say a political science which has no ideas and no connection to historiographical facts is totally illiterate. But on the other hand, a historian who has no contact to the concepts of political science is blind. These are, two facts we have to go in between. If we come to this new concept, you ask me, Neo-Osmanism.
First of all, I'd ask you to, if I may, to describe the main ingredients of the Ottoman Empire. I think we have all studied read about it, but
sorry for that. Ottoman Empire covered the boundaries of Danube, today's Hungary, and as Hungary's autonomous Hungarian kingdom, the Transylvania. This is a part of modern Romania. So the independent Hungarian character of Lutheran Hungary, not Catholic, Roman Catholic, Lutheran Hungary occurred under the sovereignty of the Ottomans. It started so, and it has been protected and provoked by Ottoman dynasty, Suleiman Magnific. That's a fact. And the very Protestant Lutheran character, which was very close, unlike other Middle European countries, to England and Germany in culture. That's just, the Turkish age of domination, very typical. So, on the other hand, of course, Ottoman Empire included Crimean Khanate, totally Muslim, and the Turk-speaking people, but semi-autonomous. And nearby, of course, part of Caucasus, and then very strong wars with Iranians. But it's strange enough, Iranian dynasties were pure Turkish as Ottoman dynasty. And they had a good part of, Mashriq Arabia, Eastern Arabia, the gentleman's country, and beginning of 16th century Egypt, and after that, very rapidly, the whole of Muslim North Africa, Maghreb. And these countries kept, Ottoman dominion or Ottoman administration, as it was in Hungary, almost 200 years, over 500 years in Bulgaria, over just 400 years for Arabian countries, and around 300 for African Arab world. And Crimea was also very lost first country, lost to Russia, and that created in Russia, a sense of hostility, because Russians had now, a large group of Muslims at their subject, and we had, the Turks had in their empire, a large group of Slav peoples who spoke. The Jews of this Turkish empire are Sephardic Jews, so they have another culture, as Russia and Poland had this Ashkenazi groups. But in 18th, 19th century, we started with an amalgamation of the migration of the Ashkenazi Jews to Ottoman Empire. And there we have created another colorful culture, that's Turkey. This Ottomanism is just the name of the dynasty. And till 19th century, one cannot talk about Ottoman identity. The Turks called themselves Muslims, sometimes Turks, of course, as they are Turks, that's a subtitle. As many Orthodox called themselves, we are Hellenics. For example, it was the case with Bulgarians. Even the first precursor of the Bulgarian national schools, he was a very rich man, studied, of course, in Greek schools. And when he was in Ukraine, he has been instructed by Ukrainian historian Venelin. He said, you are a Bulgar. You had a wonderful empire in the past, etc. Now you have to turn. So this kind of identity crisis is very typical. So today, after the birth, emergence of nationalism and transformation of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, it's totally a nonsense to talk about Ottomanism, Neo-Osmanism, and nonsense.
Okay. We'll come to that, Professor.
That if you ask, I mean, I'll talk about it. Better don't come.
You're starting at the end.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, Professor Kırmızı, if I might ask you, as a political scientist and as a comparative historian, to follow up what we have just learned, what is your assessment of the heritage of the Ottoman Empire, especially the political and cultural aspects of it, for today's Turkey?
Yeah, it depends on the time which we are talking about. I mean, 10 years ago, I would say Ottoman studies or the Ottoman Empire was an orphan past because nobody was, taking it at its own legacy in the world of the nation states. But more and more, I mean, and this is what I think you are talking about, Neo-Ottomanism, more and more this legacy is inherited or talked about in Turkey. And a misunderstanding might be, I mean, which Ottoman Empire are they talking about? I mean, this is why I also, like Professor Ortaylı, don't call it Neo-Ottomanism. We call it in Turkish Abdulhamitçilik or Ecdatperestlik. I mean, because it's about there are certain persons or times which are talked about. For example, today is the commemoration of the taking of Istanbul, and now it's Fatih Sultan Mehmet who's talked about today, for example. Yeah, so it's changed from time to time, but there are different kinds of anxieties about the present. It's a presentist world, and therefore, this is what I'm telling, it's changing. This debate and this discourse is changing because we are talking also, debating the Kemalism of Erdogan. I mean, in certain times, foundation of the Turkish Republic, etc., the 23rd of April, I don't know, the 29th of October, then he becomes a Kemalist, for example. So we are very selective in taking these discourses into account. And the main problem is actually the commemoration culture. It's a centenary of the First World War, about which Eugene Rogan wrote many books. And without this centenaries, actually, we wouldn't speak now about the Neo-Ottomanism. Neo-Ottomanism is actually a dog which doesn't bite. It's all about it's all about talking, and why I am a critique of this discourse in my country is because it's intoxicating domestic politics and intoxicating young brains in this post-truth era. And not that it could be, serious challenges for the Balkans or the Middle East. It's mostly about the talking. And there is not just one identity. This is why I'm saying it's selective, to talk about this. Ideologies and identities are created in an ecology of identities. They don't exist in isolation. And in this means, these identities and ideologies are in a global dialogue. If, for example, Neo-Ottomanism in Turkey is in dialogue with Islamophobia in Europe, let's say. So they are bearing each other, they are feeding each other, and therefore, for example, we think that it's something new, but I was asked in 2010 to write a critique to this Neo-Ottomanism. And if you Google the word, you will see even in 2004, 2005, there were critiques of Neo-Ottomanism, and I would ask, what happened in this 15 years? I mean, are there serious outcomings, results, which would, worthwhile this fear of Europeans about this discourse?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Professor Rogan, let me ask you as an Orientalist, as a historian, and the only non-Turk, or maybe non-Turkish man on this panel, to be correct. What is your assessment, and you have done a lot of research on this, what is your assessment of the meaning for nowadays Turkey, of the way the European powers acted at the time of the decline of the Ottoman Empire? What does it mean for Turkish identity today, and what is the relevance for a Turkish-European relationship?
Well, I think if we take the word Ottomanism, this meant a domination of the Eastern Mediterranean world by an empire based in Istanbul or Constantinople, and that was the norm of European diplomacy really from the 15th century until the 19th century. And the Ottoman Empire was a state to be feared. But thinking about our last panel, capitalist Europe began to expand in ways that allowed it to overtake the Ottoman Empire militarily and politically and institutionally, economically above all. As it looked to the Ottoman Empire, though in absolute terms it wasn't declining at all, but it was falling behind its European neighbors, increasingly the European powers began to speak of this Eastern Mediterranean in terms of an Eastern question. That question was not, what do we do about the declining Ottoman Empire? Rather, it's what do we do to manage the ambitions of European powers in geostrategic territory? Thinking about the way the Ottoman Empire buffered Russia from the Mediterranean world, it was very important to Britain and France, the Mediterranean powers. Thinking about French ambitions in North Africa, looking for an outlet in the Syrian coastline, Britain was very keen to contain France. And so you see right through the 19th century an effort by the European powers to try and prevent each other from land grabs in Ottoman territory that might disturb the peace in Europe. And it's not until the First World War that the European powers actively take the decision to answer the Eastern question by killing the sick man. They take the action of not just going to war with the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, but to engage right through the years of the war in negotiations on how to partition the Ottoman Empire. You know the agreements, the Constantinople Agreement of 1915, the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence of 1916, Sykes-Picot, also 1916, the Balfour Declaration, Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, right down to the agreement in San Remo that leads to the ultimate partition. So right through the war years, you see the European powers trying to decide among themselves how they will kill the Ottoman Empire and carve up its body. But here's the trick. In their priority to balance each other's empires or imperial ambitions, the Europeans were only looking at the balance of power in Europe. They never gave any thought to what might make for a stable Middle East as a region of the world. And so they came up with a set of boundaries through that process, their answer to the decline of the Ottoman Empire. The boundaries have been very enduring, but the problems that were built into those boundaries have also been very enduring. And I think they defined the post-Ottoman legacy in a Middle East that would be a zone of conflict for the past 100 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Kınıklıoğlu, you are a former politician, now you're a think tanker, you're a scholar. And I know that you focus a lot on Turkish politics and also always try to explain it in the context of the European powers, but also in the historical context. And I would be very interested to learn more from you. I mean, there was the World War I, and there was no more Ottoman Empire, but at the same time, Atatürk mentioned with his people, with his troops, to found a new Turkey in 1923. And you have written about this as well. How can you explain to people who are not historians that after the decline of an empire and after the loss of a war, how would somebody be able to mobilize his troops, his people, in order to build a new state? And what does this period of history mean for nowadays Turkish politics and identity?
Okay, well, it's quite a task to respond to this in a
easy
satisfactory manner, but I will give my best. I think for an audience that may not be specializing on Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, what needs to be underlined is the Ottoman Empire was fundamentally a Balkan empire. Many of the key personalities came from the Balkans. The loss of the Balkans with the Balkan War was a huge trauma for the elite and society. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people coming from former Ottoman territories back into a poor, war-ridden Anatolia of the Turkey of today. So the founders of the Republic and those who fought the independence war had already at hand a decade of warfare. If you started from 1911 up to 13, so up to 1923, already a very tired, demoralized, huge population, Muslim population, Turkish population from the Balkans, from North Africa, from other parts of the empire. So I think it's a miracle. If you look at the independence war and the success in restarting a nation state of the most, maybe not the most, but one of the more remote or less developed or less prioritized areas of the empire in today's Anatolia, is a remarkable achievement. The Republic, for many long years, also secured Turkey's borders. It managed to be a non-irredentist and have claims of former Ottoman territory. It managed peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with most of its neighbors for a very long time. But I think the emergence of Ottomanism in recent decades and the whole questioning now of the secular republican narrative of what Turkey is, what its borders should be, what Turkish identity should be, is something really more an outcome of Turkey's domestic political dynamics. And you know, the fact is, the Republic has been a shock to the system with its reforms. Yes, the Republic and the elite did not come from space. It's actually an end result of maybe 200 years of westernization. But it's still, you know, if you would talk to today's conservatives or Islamist elites in Turkey, you know, today's neo-Ottomanism is in one respect a reaction to what the Republic has achieved and what sort of identity it has shaped. Many of these neo-Ottomanists question now some of the diplomatic processes that led to the establishment of the Republic. They question the Lausanne Treaty and etc. So there is a challenge to the Republican secular identity, but my observation, and I have to humbly accept, I'm no historian and maybe I shouldn't even be on this panel, but my observation as someone who lives in Turkey and has a keen interest in the issue is, I find that neither militant secularists nor Turkey's Islamists really understand the Ottomans. Mm-hmm. I think the Ottomans were the empire was a very sophisticated, very complicated political entity. Just look at Salonika, you know, just look at Thessaloniki and the history of the city, etc. But I find the the Ottomans and the empire in Turkey's political discourse, in this polarized political discourse, loses out. Neither the Kemalists nor the Islamists choose to narrate and understand the empire and the past as it is. It's very selective for own political needs and you know, more utilitarian rather than trying to understand what the Ottomans were really all about.
Thank you. Professor, when I was at school, I'd learned that that Atatürk is the father of the Turks.
That's his family name.
Yes.
He adopted.
That is true.
Given to him.
True.
Because,
But now, if I asked,
had no family name, no, that's very serious. The Turks had no family names. They used their father's name. And around the table, I mean, in the government office, in the provinces, this so-called, I mean, semi-idiotic bureaucrats distributed sometimes, I mean, family names. These are as funny as, for example, the German Hollanders' family names, because Napoleon forced people to take some family names. And Hadelsteiner, etc., that goes on. Our family names are basically on that way, but we use it. Atatürk and the members took different family names, I mean. The discussion, I know, is not the place to tell all of them. They are very rhetorical. So father of the Turks is one of them, but Turks use it today. So there is no discussion about it.
We know, but we know who we are talking about, and I also learned that these bureaucrats have always existed. That is also important. However, my question was, if I asked people in Turkey nowadays about their historical heritage, and I asked them the question, and I would ask a person who is, I don't know, a banker, a middle-class person in Istanbul, I ask the same question, and then I go to somebody who lives in a rather remote village, and I asked the same question. What would people answer?
The answer of the people would be, I mean, we had very great padishahs, because the first 9 of them are really great marshals. That's what the Turks like. After this war of, I mean, 7 days, Israel and Arabs, the Arabs had been defeated, you know. And people would expect maybe all the Israeli tourists will be, I mean, went back. Or, I mean, the Turks will get very angry. No, they say, well, they are good warriors. That's the trouble.
But
and they like the marshals. The Turks like their marshals. That's very important. One has to understand the state, that's an institution, semi-holy institution. That's, I mean, I ask it to veterans of the war, because I'm old enough today. You don't like your officers, as seems to me, to veteran. Why did you go to the war? I mean, after First World War, Balkan War, again to Resistance War, I mean, the so-called independence. Well, my boy, you can't understand. The state is holy. That's none of your business. If the state calls, we go. That's very important. This type of synchronological or anachronological conceptualization is quite interesting and strange. That's what people don't understand. That's very important. So he's a marshal, a founding marshal of the Republic and the founding one after World War. It's quite strange. Only 2 men had good understanding of War of Independence after First World War. I mean, the country was occupied, all the crews were there, they're here, the armies, etc. He came from Syrian front, and that's, what are these? Well, studies like that. He said, well, they came and will go back. That was the situation, he knew that. And the second one is quite interesting. Not the commander, high commissioner of British Army, or I mean the so-called officers of occupational armies. General Metaxas from Greek army. He was opponent of Venizelos and said, don't step to Asia Minor, I mean. They have an army, will rise in 2 days and will push you away. And it happened on that way, because the man was a first-class warrior and first-class strategist. He could understand the structure of this army. That's very important. Greek dictator, very smart man, had a German training in Potsdam, as well as in his country. That gives us, I mean, the structure of that. The second one is, of course, the first owners of the Topkapi Palace could not die in their palace. All of them on battlefield. That shows also, that's, I mean, the heritage of Ottomanism in Turkey. That has nothing to do with monarchism. If you built a party of monarchy, no one would come there, I mean. Unlike Austrians, we are not so proud of, I mean, only monarchy. If the members of the monarchy are well, then they come. If not, I mean, then you forget. Certainly, I mean, Abdulhamit is the late one, but a reformator in Ottoman Empire, in schools, etc., railway, wonderful, very interesting diplomacy, banking. He was first-class carpenter, first class. I mean, that's.
Well,
I mean.
let's then. I have my question to
With
learn
this
more
question,
about.
So now comes the Neo-Ottomanism. Let me talk about it, then I can't because the concepts are very. I'm not accustomed to this type of panel.
Okay, so
I'll tell you, there is a Neo-Ottomanism. This Neo-Ottomanism is never heard by me. I am a professor.
We are still not there.
No. I am a professor. I am in the politics sometimes. I have different people from conservatives as well as from communists. Neo-Ottomanism is not a word of Turkey. This is totally a European production. And those people who used in Turkey are either journalists who have contacts to foreigners, I mean, because of their knowledge in languages, or some scholars, I mean, who have contacts to foreign people, and especially in Germany. Why do you use this Neo-Ottomanism?
Okay,
it's strange for me. No, that's the question from me. Why do you use it?
Listen,
you have here a community of Turks. These Turks are conservative. Okay, I know. Very conservative. That angers me sometimes too. But I mean, their love for monarchy is only nonsense, nothing else. Do not afraid of that, I mean, calmez-vous, beruhigung. That's Neo-Ottomanism of that. We have nothing to do with them. This Turkey cannot apply any kind of Neo-Ottomanism. We have a very modern army. They are not conquerors.
Professor, I'm a peaceful person, so I have to ask the others
but
as well,
I mean,
because
don't use this type of concepts. I mean, our diplomats are neither idiots.
Professor, we are not there. We are not there yet.
Be journalists, yes, I mean, for them I can give you any guarantee for you.
Let us. I got what you're saying, so we'll get to that. Very interesting discussion. Eugene, I'd like to ask you, you told me earlier, I'm an expert on the Arab world.
Did I say that?
You did say that, and me being an Orientalist, I was
listening
listening carefully.
With the audience, I know.
So I was, for me to better understand, I mean, the Ottoman Empire was known for its tolerance, no? Especially towards minorities. No, we had the whole concept of the dhimmis, of the people protected who were not Muslims. But nowadays, there are people saying, well, if you look at Turkey, it seems as if there's the predominantly they're Sunni. They follow the Sunni Islam, and they're kind of the protector of Sunni Islam in parts of the Arab world as well. Do you see that, or that is also an interpretation of journalists and politicians or others? What is the perception from the Arab world towards Turkey? As in the there's one, of course, at the past, the big Ottoman Empire, and nowadays, what is kind of the big changes? Are they seen as protectors of Sunni Islam, or is that also a kind of projection of our thinking?
I mean, one has to bear in mind that the Arab world has a very complex relationship to Turkey as a result of the Ottoman legacy. There is a lot of Arab nationalist rhetoric based around the idea that what's held the Arabs back in the 20th century was the Ottoman Empire. And so there's a sense of scapegoating. And to be honest, very little love is lost between Turks and Arabs either. I am always struck, having written a book on the First World War in the Middle East, how many Turkish audience members will tell me that they think that the Arabs betrayed the Ottomans, whether it was through their secret societies and nationalism, or the Sharif's uprising and the Hijaz against the Ottoman Empire. So I think you have a lot of the 20th century in which Arabs and Turks were set down a path of mutual antagonism. And that's shaped the way in which the Arab world views modern Turkey. They would not look to Turkey as a natural leader of the Arab world until the 21st century. So my question is, do we wish to address the 21st century too, or do you want me to hold back?
You can address it, because then we'll because he's pushing me into that direction.
We're all pushing
to
that way.
To discuss
We're so desperate to get Neo.
So we'll get closer to nowadays.
Okay, we're going to get a little more Neo here. What changes in the 21st century, and particularly in the Arab Spring revolutions of 2011, is that you had a series of parties that were either the Muslim Brotherhood or franchises of the Muslim Brotherhood who took advantage of revolutions in Tunisia and Nahda, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood itself. Hamas is a franchise in Gaza. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, very active there. You go around the region, you'll see 2011 looked to many to be a kind of Muslim Brotherhood wave. And then AKP in Turkey stood out as the role model of what a Muslim democratic party that comes to government by electoral means, so within a democratic system, looks like. And it was very important, I think, for Muslim Brotherhood franchises that until 2011 had only been known as opposition movements, to be able to hold Turkey up as a role model. And the newspapers in Cairo trumpeted banner headlines because Abdullah Gül was president at that time, Erdogan was prime minister, Davutoğlu was foreign minister. They were received like rock stars right across the capitals of the Arab Spring. The Egyptians were saying, you know, give us Erdogan for 3 months and we'll solve the post-Mubarak era. And so, you know, there we're really getting into when people begin to talk about a neo-Ottomanism. Why? Well, on the one hand, it's seeing Turkey as a power center for the Eastern Mediterranean again. It is the role model for what the Arab Spring revolutions might look like. And two, it's a Turkey that's redefined itself away from its Kemalist role model, very much in line with a new strong man and a new strong model in Erdogan. I mean, how strong he was to become, we were only to find out afterwards, and that's another story. But I think that really redefines, but it's for a fixed moment in time, because by the time we reach 2013, it's already gone. But in that moment, I think you can really see where the Arab world looked to Turkey in a new way as a role model and was talking about Turkey influencing a kind of political climate that many hoped in 2011 would spread from North Africa through the Arab lands.
Suat, you have been very close to this process. You have been in Parliament, you were the Deputy Speaker of the Foreign Relations Committee. What happened? Because I remember in 2011 there was enthusiasm in the Arab world, but there was also close partnership to a certain extent with the Europeans. So of course, we always had these talks about joining or not the EU, but in general, there were very good relationship, and we learned about this whole idea of zero problem foreign politics. I think we have all been a little bit skeptical about this. But what happened exactly the moment Eugene is describing?
I think Eugene touched on a very important point. To contextualize where we are today, I think the Arab Spring played an important role. I think Erdogan, Davutoğlu, Gül, the party leadership thought this was a Turkish moment. Indeed, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in many places, pro-Ihwan or Ihwan movements were coming to power or were part of the coalition. Relations with the European Union were already not going further. It wasn't as bad as it is now, but it was also stuck. France already put 5 vetoes on 5 key chapters. The Greek Cypriots vetoed things. So things were not moving on the European front anyway. And the interesting thing, of course, is I've written about this. When the Arab Spring erupted, relations were actually quite tense with Israel and the United States over the Mavi Marmara incident and also Turkey's veto in the United Nations Security Council to sanctions against Iran. But the moment the Arab Spring erupted, I think there was a reassessment in Washington which propagated Turkey again as a model to these newly revolutionizing regions, just like in the 90s when Turkey was being propagated as a model to the Central Asian republics. And interestingly, Obama, again, you know, the Turkey model was sort of marketed in a way that this is the way you should be going, these new revolutionizing Arab societies. I think there was also a bit of hubris on our part. I mean, there was an overconfidence what Turkey could do and what Turkey was up to. I mean, I remember sitting in the party headquarters, we would get delegations from Iraq, from Yemen, from Egypt, you know, people who had never run a political campaign were asking us, how should we organize? How can we set up a women's branch in the party? How do you run a campaign? So there was a huge interest, and we from a capacity point of view, were not able to keep up with it. But coming to, I think, which is the essence of this, this panel, Ottomanism. And I know İlber Ortaylı doesn't like the term, but I think in our domestic politics, there is something called Osmanlıcılık, Ottomanism. You see it on, you know, there is a cultural, I would say, awakening, which I wrote about in 2008, 2009. You could see it. There are new foundations, associations who had an interest in Ottoman history, in Ottoman customs. So you saw banners of the Ottoman Tura, you know, in the cars. You see Abdulhamit's pictures all over the place. So there was a cultural awakening, and I think with the reality that the EU process was not going to go anywhere anytime soon, coupled with the fact of the Arab awakening or the Arab revolutions, I think the leadership thought that this was a Turkish moment that one should capitalize on. But I agree with once Gezi Park and then the aftermath happened, I think it was a short time period. But in domestic politics, if you look, for instance, to Erdogan's reaction to the coup in Egypt in 2013, if you look how Ottoman identity, if you look on, you know, when an operation into Mosul is done, when there are disagreements between Turkey and Greece over islets that have over status issues in the Aegean. If you look at Aleppo, you know, you see a language that is not the secular Republican narrative that we are used to. You see a longing for grandeur, for being a great a power that people respect again. And I think, I'm not going to say it's, you know, there were irredentist overtones, but I think it was never state or party policy. But I think the Neo-Ottomanism as it is today, and I understand it more as a political concept entertained in Turkey's domestic politics, is there. It is still alive, and I think there were times a few years ago when people were calling our president the new Khalif of the Sunni world. Now, how exaggerated or how unrealistic those things may be, the fact is in our society, in our social media, in our discourse, Neo-Ottomanism is part of the equation. And I think it is in contrast to the secular Republican experience. but I agree, to some extent, to what İlber Ortaylı says on how it's being instrumentalized in English, German, or
We'll
external discourse
come to that.
to criticize the government. I think there I agree with him. But I think I underline we need to talk about Neo-Ottomanism, what it means in Turkey's domestic politics.
Sure. I mean, as we learned earlier, it's mainly referring to Sultan Abdulhamit II. So you're also called Abdulhamid. You're carrying quite a prestigious burden. Let me put it like this, Mr. Kırmızı, from your point of view, we have learned one person saying this concept does not exist. It doesn't make sense. You're saying it's rather a concept. I think you, Eugene, have an idea that it is there. Let me ask you the question, is it an invention, a concept from the West, projecting on Turkey's current situation? Is it a new Orientalism, so to say? Is it an invention that came from the West and then was absorbed by people in Turkey? Or where does the concept, the idea come from? Who has first labeled it, if you know? And do you believe it's there or not?
First of all, the sharpening of patriotistic identity is a global phenomenon. And sharpening also of this nostalgia feeling. But we never talk about neo-Hohenzollerism if we talk about German power in the EU. Or we never talk about neo-Habsburgism when someone from the Habsburg family becomes an MP in the Austrian parliament. Or we never talk about the Holy Roman Empire when we see that the European Union is the greatest trade partner of the Balkan states, okay? So, there is an agenda of using neo-Ottomanism in Germany, especially in the German media, and we have to see this. And actually, I'm afraid that this discourse will make all opponents Erdoganist in Turkey. I mean, if you move on with, if the Western media moves on with using this kind of labels, it doesn't give, it problematizes, it limits the space of the internal natural opposition in Turkey. I mean, you don't, it limits the discourse in Turkey, the opponent discourses in Turkey. Yes, it's a reactive, if something like this exists, as I told you, it's here and there, and I'm also always writing about this misuse or disuse of history in the political field. And despite of course, I believe that history is the most political discipline, of course. Why is it a reactive act? Think about, Suat mentioned the Balkan Wars and the trauma after the Balkan Wars. This was because also part of that trauma was the distrust to the great powers who, at the beginning of the Balkan Wars in 1912, said we will back to the status quo ante after the war, so don't fight anymore, these kind of things. And then afterwards, when they saw that the Balkan states were winning over the Ottoman Empire, they didn't, take on this promise. They forgot this promise. So this was part of the feelings why people were eager to enter the First World War, to get their territories back. Because as, again, Suat just told, let me give an answer. Bosnia was was an Ottoman province 50 years before Erzincan, which is in the midst of Anatolia. So the Ottoman Empire was a Balkan empire from the very invention, from the very beginning. So just to understand what the loss of the Balkans meant for the Ottoman Empire. So we have this, I guess, Turkey has this feeling again. It stayed in the waiting room of the European Union for, 40 years, 50 years, and in 2002, 2003, when AK Party came to government, I mean, nobody expected such a, a winning policy to get into the European Union. The first visits were to Brussels, to London, I mean, to Berlin, etc. And even now, I mean, yesterday there was a delegation from the European Union in Ankara. And losing the hopes that the European Union will accept the Turkey, and there is also this idea, this is because of its Muslim identity. As Esra Özürek in the morning said that, first the Turks here were Gastarbeiter, then they would become Turks, and then they become Muslims. I mean, the European discourse is producing this otherizing, I mean, naming his other as Muslim. And if you tell him that he's a Muslim, he will identify himself with the same name. I mean, this is like what we are calling, the Ottoman Empire wouldn't say itself Ottoman Empire, it would call itself Devlet-i Aliye. Ottoman Empire was first used in the first Ottoman Parliament after the Ottoman Empire was lost. It's like that. I mean, or then even the name Turkey, I mean, Turkiya was first used by the Italians in the 15th century. Yes. And
not 15th.
12th century. Sorry, Professor.
We called ourselves Roman Empire, Rumi.
Yeah.
They called us, using the Turkish element, Turkiye or Turkmenia. And it is right, because the country was occupied by the tribes.
So there is a reflexivity, I mean, of daily, of what's happening today. I mean, the discourses on the past are always about what happens in the present, and it can change. I mean, I have just heard that Merkel invited Erdogan after the elections to Berlin, for example. I mean, you have to see that there was a great trauma after the Gezi events, the coup d'etat attempt in 2015. I mean, it changed the whole ground of politics. And this is why domestic and foreign policies, the borders of this kind of different policies, politics blurred in Turkey. And actually, when Erdogan is talking about the Ottomans, it's about the domestic policies. As I said at the beginning, I mean, there's a discrepancy between real power and the discourse on the Ottomans in Turkey. I mean, tell me, for example, I mean, what's the substance of this threat, of this fear of Turkey's Ottomanist discourse? For example, soap operas was told, was it Professor Ivan, yesterday? I mean, we are watching American soap operas or American Netflix series. It doesn't make us Americans, yeah? Okay.
True. Well, let me. I can hear the urge about talking about the current situation of Turkish politics, the domestic dimension, but also the international dimension. But I still want to understand, because I think that's a crucial question. You say Neo-Ottomanism does not exist.
We don't
say it's a concept, and you say it's basically coming from the West. It's how Western media.
From the party only. We don't know it.
Professor, I was going to ask him, and then it's your turn. Is it an Orientalism? Is it something that the West has invented, has kind of put as a concept to Turkey, and now we use it, and we are kind of back to kind of power politics to show who's strong and who's not, and what we project? And is it a problem of the current discourse, this Neo-Ottomanism, or do you think it really came from inside Turkish society and then has been adopted by these Western journalists?
Now, the wrong person to say whether the term came out of Turkish society or not. I mean, my other panelists will be better placed, having followed that, having written on Neo-Ottomanism going back to over 10 years now. I think, to me, it's simply to try and put distance between Europe and Turkey. Mm-hmm. So for the moment you designate the current state as Neo-Ottomanist, you're reinforcing the notion that Turkey's place is in Asia and not in Europe. And we're going back to the point that Suat was making about the ever-receding possibility of Turkey's acceptance as a member of the EU or a closer association with the EU. And so I think that's what people are responding to. I mean, personally, when I am in Turkey and I hear people speak of Erdogan in Ottoman terms, it's to mock him. It's not to praise him. They refer to him as a sultan. He's built a huge presidential palace in Ankara. They call it, you know,
Like
the
a
Sultan.
joke, yeah?
You know, so this is not to praise him. I hear a lot of irony from Turks about the Ottomanized manners of a man who's becoming increasingly autocratic in a way which goes against, for many urban Turks, their secular Kemalist values and with which they are not comfortable. So they use it as a term of derision. But the Orientalism of all of this, I can't say. But I know that in Europe, the moment you say it's Ottoman, it's certainly not European. And so it's another way of just rebuffing Turkey, as they've been doing for generations now.
Okay, so it's used as a political power instrument, so to say.
But don't forget the way the Turks use it too, which,
Yeah.
as I said, is a way of trying to distance themselves from someone whose manners go so far from the Kemalist values that they are divided over.
So you're well placed to explain to us, as outsiders of Turkish politics, how is this Ottoman concept or this referring to Sultan Abdulhamit II, how is that used in the discourse, in the domestic political discourse in Turkey for us to understand, especially with the political elites?
Well, look, you know, I remember reading a piece about Turkey and Russia, axis of the excluded. Both of these countries aspired to become a part of Europe. They tried. You know, Turkey changed its alphabet, its dress code, adopted the calendar, etc. You know, Turkey has been trying to integrate into the European. Turkey is part of the economic, cultural, geographic space, but it's not accepted as a political equal within the European political context. In this case, it's the European Union. I think what we're talking about needs to be understood within the conservative Islamist movement's rise from the 70s, which is the culmination is really the Justice and Development Party and the rise of Mr. Erdogan becoming prime minister and president. In today's Turkey's discourse, it's really grandeur. It's being proud of yourself again. I think it's a reaction to the exclusion from the Western club, to be able to digest, maybe. I sometimes see it as a means of digesting the fact that Turkey is not going to become a member of the European Union for a foreseeable future. Not everything about this Ottomanism is negative. I think one healthy part of it is unintentionally, this Ottomanist, selective Ottomanist political jargon has increased huge interest in Turkey on our history. What actually happened? Is it true what Erdogan says to us? You know, what actually happened then? So you see now a multiplication of really good publications, a lot of young historians coming up, and I actually benefit a lot. I read a lot more. I think it has sparked a healthy urge for reinvestigation. What actually happened? I mean, was Abdulhamit the bloody sultan that you know, as he is portrayed, or was he a much more complicated person, a reformer, as Professor Ortaylı said? You know, so there is you know, not all of it is based on solid and objective information. But I think a lot of people also have been looking into the Ottoman past more carefully. And I think the fact that many Turks, especially in the first 8 to 10 years, as the Turkish economy grew, many Turks were able to travel much more. They visited Thessaloniki, they went to the Balkans, they went to Jerusalem. They see everywhere, they go to Sarajevo, so they see Ottoman remains, Ottoman past, they become more conscious. There is a past out there that relates to me. I mean, when I was... In the year 2000 was my first time in Sarajevo. When I walked first time in the Başçarşıya, I was moved. I thought, there is something here about me that I need to know more about. Because, you know, I'm not an expert on Turkish history education, but my understanding is the Republican Turkish history education was selective in some areas, but to incorporate, to teach to our children, but it was not really giving enough. It was not enough to satisfy the thirst and hunger to understand a long, rich, complicated, sophisticated past, which we know was the Ottoman Empire.
Professor, do you see this increase in interest in Ottoman Empire studies? Do you see young scholars? And what kind of topics are they mostly interested in?
For that interest, I mean, people wouldn't spend their time, I mean, especially in studies. Today's students, we tried, I mean, would choose another way. Computer science, engineering, agronomy, or law studies, or economy, business, etc. But they have started to read Ottoman history in large quantities, of course. And we are haunted by TV programs. I mean, we, the scholars, come and talk to the people. And as far as you do, you will go hunted more and more. That's a fact in Turkey.
So you're a TV star at home?
Yeah, but because of that, I'm one of the first hunted by TV, I mean, but I don't like this mind, I mean, so the media world in Turkey is not able to follow all these developments, improvements, which he talked now. Not even, of course, the parties. The parties in Turkey have nothing to do with that. Whether left or right, they are totally ignorant provincial people. That's the catastrophe, I mean. A political movement, apart from structure, political attitude, has to be consisted first of all elite people of the country. This is the lacune in Turkish policy. Our elites are outside of the country. And so the provincial politicians cannot follow it. Even this Ottomanism is one of them. Of course, there are interesting approaches in Arab world. The first one is, I mean, we are an industrial country. They are not. Then secondly, of course, however, we don't have British democracy, but we had a democracy always. So sometimes broken part, the definition, but we had it. And third is, of course, I mean, we have more or less a kind of laicist attitude, not laïc, laicist attitude. And large groups in Arab world today, in Lebanon, in Palestine, even in Syria, especially in those mixed countries, cosmopolitan groups, are fond of that type of laicism. That's why, I mean, there was a tendency. But do not exaggerate it for both. Neither the Turks nor the foreigners should not exaggerate it. Arabia is Arabia. They hated each other, you know, during history. Just after the conquest of Sultan Selim, 2 years only, 1516, 1517, he had the hand even in Algiers, definitely in Egypt, in whole eastern part. He had to appoint the scholars, the judges, and madrasa professors from both countries. The first group was, I mean, Anatolia and Rumelia. That means the Turks, the Bosniaks, and Tartars of Crimea, this first group. The second one was only Arabs. He never brought them together because they mocked each other, Turkish and Arabic. They hated each other. And so that, I mean, in order to keep them away, not zwei Katzen in einem Sack. No, keep them away from each other. And this is a part. Secondly, of course, what is this Ottomanism at all? Ottoman heritage, that was your question. If you read, I mean, Hungarian modern sources, you have another idea. Very serious Ottomanism and Turkology studies. If you read, for example, I mean, Israeli studies, Jewish studies in Israel, however, he's not an Israeli citizen, the late Bernard Lewis, they are quite serious about Turkish studies and Ottomanism, sometimes very positive, even today. So different countries. And if you read, for example, the great historian of Romania, he says, thanks to the Ottoman, we are escaped of Russian assimilation. So these are ideas, different evaluation. Of course, if you read, I mean, Bulgaria, there is another idea, very unpopular, very, very negative one. It's strange enough, overnight, Zhivkov, the communist humanist leader, sent 300,000 Turks out of the boundary, overnight. And interesting enough, why? I still don't understand. These Turks, they had studies in Bulgaria, the rights. They studied there in gymnasiums, even in the university, and very well studied, very well qualified. Why do you drop them out? It's interesting. What kind of a nationalism was that? I can't understand it. They had a good knowledge of Bulgarian, Russian like every Bulgarian, and even Western culture, much better than the Greece or Yugoslavia. So these are facts, I mean. Changes from country to country. Even in Turkey, we have this type of discrepancies between different groups of faith, the orders, etc., and that goes on. Ottomanism and Ottoman heritage is not easy to understand. Yeah, that's
Thank you. Thank you. This for sure is very clear, and I think we also, all of us, are more interested than before to learn more about this time of history. But before I open up for questions from the audience, I'd like to ask one question to you with regard to current political relations between the West and Turkey and the Arab world. The elephant in the room seems to be the Kurdish question. And what I understand from the Turkish perspective, it's very unfortunate the main enemy of the Americans is Al-Daesh, is the Islamic State, and they are cooperating with the YPG, a Kurdish group, to fight the Al-Daesh group. As well, as you know, that we have cooperated, Germany has cooperated with the Peshmerga, and some of the weapons are now with the PKK. So my question is that really the elephant in the room in our relations, that from a Turkish perspective, the West wants to create a Kurdish state, while Turkey, for various reasons, does not want that? Is that true, or is it... Let me start with Suat, because he looks very enthusiastic to answer that question.
Do I? Do I? Well, I mean, I think analyzing Turkey's relations with Europe, what the Kurdish role or the U.S. European involvement in Syria and Iraq, etc., I think it's a whole different discussion. I think I really wanted to get back what Abdulhamit Kırmızı said. I think the German media or German discourse or the English-speaking discourse is wrong in assuming, in painting Mr. Erdogan or what's going on, in this sort of very condescending sort of language, that has any impact. Actually, it has an impact. It has a negative impact. It actually marginalizes room for a normal political discourse in Turkey, because nativists, populists, authoritarians, they, one of the most important markers of authoritarian rule is you delegitimize the legitimate opposition in the country. And when it comes to the Kurds, when it comes to whether Turkey's foreign policy is described as neo-Ottoman, etc., you see this condescending language. We live in a world when a news piece comes out, half an hour later, the remote village in Anatolia gets to see it, and that's how it is. And I think.
But Suat, the Kurdish state.
The Kurdish state, the Turkish state view, I don't share that view. The Turkish state views the formation of a Kurdish state in Syria or in Iraq as a threat to its territorial integrity and the unity of the country. And it's opposed. I mean, it's a very clear position. Turkey even is insisting on this policy at the expense of deteriorating its partnership with the United States over very long decades. And the tension is out there. It continues to be out there. We know the ban on campaigning here in Germany and other countries, whereas you see in some countries, not every, that ban is applied, but then you see other parties campaigning in these countries as well. So consistency,
so this is double standards.
Yeah, consistency, principled approach, yes, but exacting your dislike of a particular person or a particular policy selectively, I think, is not very helpful.
Thank you. You're very diplomatic today. let me ask Eugene, and I'd like to encourage everybody who has a question, please use the microphones, because otherwise we'll not be able to hear you and our interpreters can't help us. Okay. So be ready for the questions, but Eugene, it's a very political question for an historian and
it's okay, we roll with the punches, Alamut. As a historian, it's part of the fun is to talk about politics today. And I agree very much with what Suat was saying. It's worth remembering that as Prime Minister, I think probably Erdogan's greatest accomplishment was the way he had negotiated peace with the PKK, with Abdullah Öcalan imprisoned, serving as an honest broker. The fact that as president, he in a callous way has thrown that legacy aside and instead has made the Kurdish question a sort of existential threat for Turkey is a tragedy. And it's very much at variance with the early policies of AKP. But just as we portrayed that 2-year period after the Arab awakening of 2011 as a moment in which Turkey saw the Arab world as a zone of opportunity, since 2013, it has been redefined as a zone of threat. And the one way in which Turkey is going to continue to exercise influence in its surrounding Arab neighbors is around the Kurdish question. And they simply, as Suat has said, view the Kurdish question as an existential threat. It has led to a war against Kurds at home and every possible pressure they can bring to bear, whether by deploying the military in Syria or by making very clear their willingness to do so after the northern Kurdish regions of Iraq held their referendum. That statehood, however legitimate it might be, an act of self-determination, is not on the card so long as Ankara has a say.
Thank you. Well, I suggest, I have the gentleman here, if you please briefly introduce yourself, and then if you could be so kind to, if you have a question which is addressed to one of the gentlemen on the podium, to address it to this person.
Thank you very much.
Short and sweet, that was
my name is Stepan Safarian, although I would like to have some observation what was said.
But it's rather about asking
I will be
short
very brief.
observation.
I'm among those Armenian politicians who has supported Turkish Europeanization and European integration. However, let me disagree that the problem of Turkish foreign and domestic policy starts in this stagnation in a European front, as Suat said. I read Mr. Davutoglu's book, The Strategic Debt, when he was appointed as a Turkish foreign minister. And believe me, I was afraid of the concept, of that military concept brought to the politics, because it's bringing military logic and war logic into domestic and regional politics. So my question is the following. Don't you think, although you said that this Neo-Osmanism does not exist, or this is introduced by West. However, this concept was adopted by Davutoglu, and Ottoman period was considered as a strategic asset for Turkish foreign policy.
That's a statement, not a question.
Yeah, how you can explain this contradiction between your statements and the official doctrine of Turkish foreign policy? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I had the lady there.
Thank you. Heather Graby from Open Society European Policy Institute. It's quite intimate, you know.
Why is she not allowed to take it herself?
Because we don't want long statements.
Please.
Thank you. So I have a very short question, because very fascinating discussion about the kind of neo-Ottomanism, particularly of Davutoglu after the Arab revolutions, Arab transitions in 2011. But we haven't talked very much about the lingering legacy in terms of the Balkans, because you know Turkey's role has played into domestic politics very much in that region, sometimes in a way that has actually contradicted EU policy, and of course there's Russian influence as well. And I'd just be very interested in the views of the panel on how far there's actually a commitment, really, to a role in the Balkans. How interesting is this in terms of Turkish domestic politics, a key point of Suat, for example? And how much was this mainly just a Davutoglu initiative? I'm struck by an Albanian who said to me, you know, we Albanians, we didn't have any problems with Turkey's neighbors until Davutoglu started the No Problems with Neighbors. But now it's actually causing a lot of difficulty within the region. Is there an understanding of that within the Turkish domestic debate? Thank you.
Thank you. I have the gentleman here in the... Okay. There was one more question in this area. Okay, then I have the gentleman in the back.
Rainer Liedtke, University of Regensburg. And as a historian, I would like to ask, out of ignorance, about the representation of Ottoman history in public history in Turkey, and maybe also in professional history, but especially in public history, given that we know that the Ottoman legacy of the past, let's say, 200 to 250 years is a story of decline, of relative decline. And is this represented at all, or is only the early modern Ottoman history represented as being a glorious time, and then the last 250 years, is it omitted, or is it also represented truthfully as something where not everything went according to plan?
Thank you very much. I suggest we have a first round of answers, if you could be short, and it's up to you to pick the question you want. I think, Professor, you want to start?
Which question did I?
The one, I think the one about the official doctrine might be one you want to answer.
Official doctrine of about what?
No, he was saying that the foreign minister published a book.
Foreign minister, no, he published a book that has nothing to do with this type of questions, Ottomanism or
But he's saying the
what I read.
concept
No, the concept is totally different. That's a deep strategy, profound strategy. There you don't find anything. And I'm not willing to analyze this book, I mean. This.
Okay.
The second one, I mean, you ask, of course, about Davutoglu. This used document, Neo-Osmanism, he used it somewhere, not in one place, in different places. The one was in Serbia, for example, after my mind, of course, very inconvenient, because to talk to Serbians, I mean, about Ottomanism is a little bit strange. So I would say the gentleman I think he's not an ignorant man, totally. He was very fond of, the history. He read a lot. He has a literature, a language, two languages. The one is German, for example, very rare among the Turkish intellectuals, used to historiographic material. But his policy and all his discourse here belongs only to him. I'm very serious about it. His foreign ministry and prime ministry is rather a very short time. And the prime minister didn't control his rhetoric so much, far from that. And all this belongs only to him. Because, sometimes his proposals are not acceptable, seems to be quite irrational. Sometimes he had his own dreams, of course. Dreams are not a shame, but unless they have to base on reality. So that's the only thing. The one who uses this word in our country is quite unrealistic. And the one who uses it in foreign world to describe the Turkish policy is also irrational.
Okay.
This is okay. And the second one
we have three questions and four speakers.
Yeah.
Mr. Kırmızı, I'd like to ask you, we have the question from your colleague who says that when in public history in Turkey, what period of the Ottoman Empire is most discussed? What is it really because we have been talking about Sultan Abdulhamit, or is it really the knowledge about the many centuries?
As I told you, today it's Fatih Sultan Mehmet because Istanbul was conquered in 29 May of 1453. But yeah, mostly it's Abdulhamit II who ruled in between 1876 and 1909. And he is known in the literature as a pan-Islamist, and this is a problem. And actually, I would relate it with this pan-Ottomanism, with this neo-Ottomanism of today. In the British archives, the British of that time labeled him as a pan-Islamist. Because of the shrinking empire, it became the Muslim population, the percentage was increasing in the empire, and it was thought that he would unite the Muslims in India, Egypt, etc. He would use this Islamic discourse to raise them against the colonialist powers. But at the end, Abdulhamit never used this. He knew that he didn't have the power. Okay, so it was sometimes only to tell them, I can use this, but he never used this. It is the same here, maybe with Neo-Ottomanism. The state doesn't have this power. The question with the Balkans, for example, what can you tell me about the trade ratios, for example? The European Union is the greatest trade partner, as I told you before. What is the substance? What is the power in the Balkans of Turkey? What did he implement there? In all these recent decades, we are talking about Neo-Ottomanism. What happened? Yeah, so it's symbolic. It's overrated. And if there is, any this kind of policies is contradictory, is uncoordinated. Because of the lack of the power of the state. Okay, the decline issue. We don't use the decline of the Ottoman Empire anymore. It's not about the public history, but the recent historiography. We emphasize more contingency. If the First World War didn't happen, the Ottoman Empire wouldn't collapse, as the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the German Empire would also not collapse. And it's not because of the rise and time of the nationalisms. These were the losers of the First World War, and therefore they collapsed, because other empires still moved on as empires. The British Empire, the Japanese Empire, the French Empire. So, therefore, this decline theory is not used anymore. Because you have especially asked for it, because it's too teleologically determined, because we know how the movie ends, we tend to give it a beginning. I mean, the beginning of the decline, beginning of the collapse. And this is teleology, of course.
Okay. Thank you. So do you want to answer, or maybe have your assessment of...
I think you misunderstood me. I never said Ottomanism or Neo-Ottomanism as a political jargon and political idea does not exist. I didn't say that. Someone else said that. I think it exists. Secondly, the book never mentions Ottomanism. It talks about Turkey's strategic depth. It talks about the neighborhood. And I think, as you know, I didn't like the term at all, but the way it was known in the English-speaking world was the zero problems policy. I called it personally, when I was in the party, neighborhood policy. And at the beginning, it was very successful because it did not differentiate between Turkey's Balkan, Black Sea, Caucasus, or Middle East, or Eastern Mediterranean policy. At the beginning, if you know from the Turkish-Armenian rapprochement or other issues, it had a multi-vector quality. Only after the Arab Spring, Turkey's attention fully turned to the south and spent most of its energy to the south, to especially March 2011 with the beginning of the Syrian uprising. Turkey's energy fully looked into the south, which left very little energy to the Caucasus, the Black Sea, the Balkans. And Heather, on your question, I think Turkey does things with TİKA, with some semi-state agencies tied to the prime ministry, but they are mostly in the cultural, student exchange areas. But there were mistakes made. I can tell you one. May 2010, Davutoğlu went to Sarajevo, and he made a speech, you know, that you don't want to do in Sarajevo, you know, reminding, you know, basically the speech said, we will be back, we are back. And that, maybe in reality, concretely, there wasn't much to be afraid of. But the Balkans are people where, as you know, people have very long memory, and when a Turkish foreign minister comes in and makes that speech, it scared people. And unfortunately, Turkey's foreign policy objectives could not be completed because of these mistakes, because it instantly created a reaction to what Turkey was doing, whether it was doing very well-intentioned economic, cultural ties, or whether they had something else.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not going to try to summarize a very complex debate. What I have learned is it's at least a problematic term, the Neo-Ottomanism. I do understand that there are different perspectives of what it really implies, what I think is important. And I do understand that the difficult political relations has to do with many aspects, and I think there might be wrong perspectives on each other. And I'd like to ask you a last question, because I don't see any urgent ones from public, and I also get these body language saying, well, I have one last question, and you're not even allowed to say a whole sentence. It would be a very difficult one, very difficult one. You're only allowed to say 3 or 4 words. That's the deal. The question is, if you had a Turkish time machine, okay, and you could, you already know the answer, and you could choose, what time you would have wanted to live. In the Ottoman Empire, even before, in the Atatürk's Republic, now in the times of President Erdogan, or maybe sometime in a bright future that we don't know how it will look like. So, present. 3 or 4 words.
Present.
You want to live in the...
Present.
Very good.
We are very, very glad with our time.
2018.
Very enough curious, enough problematic. That's the best, to watch every century.
Okay, thank you. Well, you're not a Turkish citizen, but you might become one eventually.
As a tourist.
As a tourist, okay.
I would go back to the tulip period, 18th century.
Tulip period.
18th century.
Okay, interesting.
Monte.
Okay.
Today and tomorrow, I mean, it's exciting. I mean, it's
so
living
today
history.
or tomorrow?
Today, and I mean, if it's today, then I will wake up in tomorrow as well. So it's an adventure to live in Turkey. I mean, to have all this history before your eyes, because what's getting on is teaching us a lot of our past as well. I mean, I understand the Hamidian times better, the Atatürk's times better. I mean, what all is done with history, with the
so both Turkish professors agree nowadays. That's interesting for historians.
Can I ask you a question?
No, not yet. Now it's his turn.
Yet, but I can.
Afterwards,
After him,
yeah.
yes. All right.
I would want to be in 2009, 2010, and be able to change the course of the leadership at the time and continue the rise of the party and Turkey. If you look at 2003 to 2010, you see Turkey's growth, per capita growth 3 times, its increase in the international system, its soft power increasing. It was doing all the right things because it's balanced east and west.
Okay.
And only after 2010 and 11, it changed its discourse. I wish we could go back and change that.
Okay.
We can still
let me say teşekkür, shukran, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists, and what's the word? They deserve a big applause from you. Thank you.
And our moderator.